Hello, and welcome to another episode of That 60s Recording Podcast, the podcast that has conversations inspired by the golden era of recording. This week, I have quite a special episode for you. We're moving ever so slightly away from the 60s, which I do quite often, let's be honest. I'm moving into 1970, so please forgive me. My guests today are Jason Kruppa and Ken Womack, who are the authors of a new book called All Things Must Pass Away, Harrison, Clapton and Other Assorted Love Songs. And the book tells the story of George Harrison and Eric Clapton's relationship from their first meeting in 1964 right through the 60s and into the early 70s, culminating in two absolutely seminal albums, in All Things Must Pass and Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs. And the story itself is pretty amazing, but then the musical detail that they both go into, so I'm talking about Womack and Kruppa, go into in the recording of both of the albums is absolutely phenomenal. It's the most detailed description of, I mean, particularly All Things Must Pass recording that exists. The amount of detective work they've done is unreal. So I'm very excited to have spoken to them about this new book. So yeah, I'm going to dive straight in. Just to warn you, both of them are present on a Zoom call, and then we lose Ken Womack towards the end of this first episode. It's not in a big flurry or anything. He just sort of stops being involved in the conversation. I think his internet breaks down or something. But the Zoom call ended, which was my fault. But then Ken disappeared off. So I think the line must have cut. So the first episode, this one today, has both of them, and then next week will just be Jason. So anyway, here we go. Part one of my conversation with Ken Womack and Jason Kruppa. There we are.
All right.
Super. So I wonder, I mean, it's interesting to me initially that there's two co-authors writing a book. I mean, who came up with the idea of the book? And furthermore, how did the process of collaborating on it work for you both?
Well, I think that falls on me. I had, thinking back several years ago, I was looking toward upcoming anniversaries, good way to sell a book. And it was clear that there was a story to be told to me about the summer of 1970 and All Things Must Pass and Layla. And at that point, the only important aspect left was to convince a guy named Jason Kruppa that this was a good idea.
Yeah, he twisted my arm. I had honestly thought that somebody had done this already. And, that the information was all out there and there wasn't really anything to, any research to do or what. It was a matter of just like pulling things together maybe. And then I looked into it and I thought, oh, this is, and Ken actually said one time, he texted me and he said, these sessions are kind of a blank, aren't they? And I thought, yeah, so there, we can really dig into this and interview people and what I wanted to do was, kind of do a Mark Lewison and walk through day by day with the All Things Must Pass sessions. And, I think I was largely able to do that. And, and Ken took Layla and kind of did the same thing, although All Things Must Pass is much more involved, obviously.
Yeah.
So that's how that started.
Yeah. All Things Must Pass has a much bigger footprint and kind of at first, I mean, to be really candid, you were thinking, and I was willing to be convinced that maybe just perhaps the book should just be All Things Must Pass. But right, I mean, to be fair, we kind of thought that way.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of thought like how are these connected? I mean, obviously they're connected because Clapton plays on All Things Must Pass, and Derek and the Dominoes come into the picture. But I wasn't really sort of getting the connection until we just started putting the pieces together, and then it made sense.
I think from a reader's point of view, it's almost that there is because as you guys have said, All Things Must Pass has a much, much larger footprint, so it takes up a bit more space physically in the book. But there feels like the Clapton story is almost like a sub narrative, if you like, of this guy blooming under you probably I'm loath to call it this, but like under George's tutelage almost, but it's not really like that. It's more just he's blossoming, watching George and being inspired by him, and the book culminates in Eric's album coming together. And so it feels like it's, All Things Must Pass is the bigger story, but there's this really lovely understory that sort of comes to the fore and finishes it off really roundly.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe not, yeah, you're right. Tutelage is not maybe the right word, but he gives him the opportunity, because as we talk about, Eric is sort of adrift in the first half of 1970, doesn't quite know what he wants to do or who he wants to be, and he begins discovering what he wants to do musically as his band comes together within these sessions. So it's George sort of giving him the opportunity, and the interesting side of that is that George really needed Eric there, as well as a lot of other musicians, but he needed that support. He was going out on his own. He's taking this big step, and he needs sympathetic musicians who are going to understand the songs that he's playing for them.
How did you, if we talk specifically about All Things Must Pass first, how did you go about trying to even piece those sessions together? I mean, I know we spoke about getting in touch with Alan White, and he features quite a lot in the parts of the book that are about All Things Must Pass, and he must have been a good source of information. But it feels like information must have just been scattered everywhere and everything crossed over each other. And how did you even start to separate it all out?
Well, it is scattered everywhere. And one thing that really helped is Chip Mattinger and had written this book co-written this book called Eight Arms to Hold You, which is about the Beatles solo recordings. And he had the dates of a lot of the sessions in there. So I could make a timeline from that, and then begin sort of filling in information when I would find quotes, or when I would talk to people, or find an article, say in an old music magazine, music paper. And so that kind of gave everything a structure, a backbone. And having that timeline for 1970 really helped us, I think, put things in order, because it really is like this information is just all over the place.
That's right. And there was some on the Layla side. We were very fortunate that Ashley Kahn, who is just a terrific writer, especially about jazz, by by
he wrote the Kind of Blue book, didn't he?
Yeah.
That's right. He's
That's
just
fantastic
terrific.
Book.
And anyway, Ashley had done the liner notes for one of the Layla special editions, and he provided those to us. I don't know that we could have done some of this work. We could not have done the work on the Layla aspect without just his wonderful research, because, Jason and I are proud of our sleuthing, but it would have been really something to have to go back and try to build a timeline out of thin air. So the Mattinger and of course, Kahn really made a difference.
Right. And Chip, answered some questions too. He was, I feel like I asked him a lot of very tedious, detailed questions, and he patiently answered that stuff for us, just to get, just to sort of sort some things out, which, even now, once the Uber box has come out, even more questions arise, and there are more details to plug in. But yeah, those things really helped. And then, there were other interviews that had, Jim Gordon obviously is in no condition to be interviewed, but there was an interview from Ken. Was that 82 maybe? That interview that I found that had just been made available the year before.
That sounds about right.
So, things like that, that just happened to come into play at just the right time when we would have access to it.
Talking about the book itself, I really enjoy how it starts off in quite a story-like way, the way you set the scene with George and then flipping over to Eric. And then it gets really, there's kind of, when you get deep into the sessions, it's really detailed, and I do really enjoy that. It's got such a nice balance of kind of storytelling and nerdy music detail, which I think is great. You guys balance that really well.
We like that you said that, because that was a late change in our process. These books are tough because you have to balance, the Beatles geeks like ourselves who know a lot of this already with the many folks who aren't aware of key aspects of their lives, the folks who may be coming to this for the first time or with only a smattering of Beatles, or in this case, Clapton knowledge. So that was a tough piece for us to weigh, but we came down on the side of doing that because the nature and quality of their relationship and how they develop as young people, which is true for all of us, I think, has a lot to do with the story of these records. And of course, the so-called love triangle that also exists inside this story. We really felt like it needed that. So knowing that it was valuable to you, who is so knowledgeable, I think that means a lot to us.
Yeah, definitely.
It set the scene for the albums perfectly. I mean, it all, I was, by the time it got to the descriptions, the sort of detailed music descriptions of the albums, I was viewing them in a different way because of the way that you guys had set the scene. And I think that was really important. If we can dig into a little bit of that, I think I really liked how, one thing I picked up particularly, so if we start off with George, so one thing I picked up particularly is how you talk about George as being quite self-confident, which I think will surprise a lot of people. How would you describe sort of the real George, if you like, as opposed to the George that people see as, a caricature member of the Beatles? What was he actually like as a musician, observing Lennon and McCartney at work?
Well, something that Jason pointed out that I was aware of, but him putting it into words really helped. Remember, when you go back to Hamburg, George is getting roughly a third of the lead vocals, right? He's a full-fledged member of that band. The calculus really starts to change when they become Lennon and McCartney, right? With the advent of the Beatles, and suddenly George looks like this late bloomer. Now, you can say that he's a late bloomer in terms of his songwriting, but he simply wasn't engaging that part of his craft to the same degree. And that forced him then to have to play catch up a little bit. He also, one of the great misnomers, and I know we use this phrase a few times in the book, is that he is the quiet Beatle. He is a very gregarious person. He is not quiet.
Right.
He's actually quite talkative, and people who knew him can tell you that he could pontificate with the best of them. And so I suppose that section is also useful just for the simple fact that it's debunking some of those issues.
Yeah, I mean, Eric Idle, who was a friend of George's, has gone on record as saying, George would never shut up. So, it is very much fighting the myth, and there are a lot of myths that I think we busted or half busted in this book. And going into those early years and talking about the development is a big part. It's very important to these are kind of, I would say these are their masterworks, All Things Must Pass and Layla for these two artists. I'm sure people love Cloud9. I'm sure people love, Living in a Material World. I'm sure there are a lot of other Clapton albums people love, but I feel like if you can be objective in any sense about people's careers, these two seem to be the ones that have the most magnetic pull to them. We keep going back to them. You always look back to these albums.
Yeah.
And so, in that sense, it's important to look at, how they got here and who these two people were.
I think the good example, well, my favorite example is a story that I think a lot of people will have heard before, but it really hits home what you guys are talking about, is the "I don't like your tie" anecdote.
Yeah.
Where he meets George Martin for the first time and comes out with that. I mean, that, if anything, sort of squashes the quiet Beatle stereotype. That's got to be.
Yeah, that's right. A wallflower doesn't do that.
No.
Right. And I mean, the thing that my favorite sort of story between George and Eric is right toward the very beginning, where George sees him and they're in a club and he sees him and his first thought is, that guy looks lonely. We should invite him to hang out with us. And it's just such a sensitive response. To me, it just opens up this whole world of like, okay, who is the George Harrison guy that we think we know? And then as you begin reading more about him, and I feel like I've read so much about George in the process of doing this comes up again and again, his generosity of spirit. Obviously he could be stingy in other ways, but I think a lot of people talk about how generous George could be and how thoughtful he was.
Yeah, that comes across in droves, especially as the book goes on, and as we we'll talk about the recording sessions. I mean, if you could describe someone as being generous in a recording, I think he's definitely generous in those sessions. I'm interested in the song "Cry for a Shadow." I had no idea. I haven't actually heard the song, but I didn't realize that George was even thinking about writing at that time, or is that just a random one-off that happened?
I mean, that's early Harrison Lynn doing a shadow, doing the Shadows, doing kind of an instrumental, like, the Shadows do instrumental guitar tunes, so we'll do one too. But that goes back to what Ken was saying about how they were all sort of working together. It's once it becomes this walled off thing of Lennon and McCartney, then George is sort of pushed to the side. And as Ken was talking a minute ago, I had this thought of like, okay, let's pretend for a moment in a weird alternate universe that Lennon and McCartney is, they're not a self-contained kind of songwriting unit. That as a band, George Martin is finding songs and they do How Do You Do It? And they do songs that he picks up from Tin Pan Alley. And, in that sense, George and John and Paul are all still equals, because if it's like Hamburg and you sort of transpose that over into the studio, they all have their, individual showcases for songs. So, to me, that's kind of part of that, like those early days where there isn't this clear boundary of like, here, we're going to be this songwriting team. That developed over time. And then it really took off once it became commercially popular. That's what George Martin was going to give his attention to. Yeah.
No, I understand that. And it seems, I can't remember the exact sort of passage that you guys wrote, but it was something along the lines of Lennon and McCartney as a duo was just so much easier to deal with, whereas as soon as it's three writers, it becomes very complicated. And it's almost not that Ringo and George were just along for the ride. They were contributing musically enormously, but that needed to be the perception, especially in the early days while they were, it's easy for the public to digest that it's just these two writing songs, and they're the front people, if you like.
Right.
If we flip over to Eric, because it's Eric Clapton is probably somebody that people will know. Obviously he's got a huge history behind him, but and sort of everybody will know Layla and the Unplugged album and be familiar with his work, but not necessarily as into his life story as a sort of people are necessarily into the Beatles stuff. He had quite a dysfunctional upbringing. I guess, Ken, were you covering Eric's life? So his upbringing was extremely dysfunctional, and he seemed to find solace in sort of playing guitar and blues music.
Absolutely. I mean, his early life is a disaster area. And he's very frank about it in his what I thought was his excellent autobiography. But he's very frank about just what a terrible experience it was, and it's the opposite of George Harrison, right? It really is. George is. George has this just almost idyllic upbringing, and Eric is just fraught with family dysfunction, and it affects him deeply. In fact, it's why, to go back to what Jason said earlier, it's why George recognizes, because he was raised so differently, this innate loneliness that existed inside of Eric, and wanted to do something about it, being a good person.
Yeah, it seems. I mean, how old? What's the age difference between them? Is there a couple of years difference?
At most, yeah.
Yeah, it seemed. I mean, I might be sort of jumping to conclusions, but something that struck me reading about both of their experiences, sort of early on in music, is. Eric lost himself in music as a way to escape his dysfunctional upbringing, and he will have, almost as a meditative thing. I'm sort of writing that myself, but sort of he will have played guitar as a way of closing his mind off to that. And George, I feel, may have done the same thing in songwriting. Away from Lennon and McCartney, when that whole early sort of Beatles thing was happening, he may well have, I feel as though he closed off and started to focus in on songwriting, because it was a way of, he had the space then to sort of spend that time doing it, because it was all about Lennon and McCartney. And I feel that they both became quite introspective people at different times within their early life, which led them to, which is, I think probably one of the reasons why they got on so well.
I think they were both very introspective. I mean, all the Beatles were introspective too, to some extent. But George, as you were saying that, I was just thinking, if you look at George's early songs, "Don't Bother Me," that's such a George Harrison song. Like, no one's going to mistake that for Lennon McCartney. And he seemed to be incapable of just writing a straight, simple pop tune at that time. When he would try, it really didn't come off that well. But when he would invest something with his personality and his sort of worldview, that's where you really saw something unique. And it was very, very different from the way John and Paul were writing. So, he's introspective, and at the same time, he's taking that introspection and he's putting a very distinctive stamp on what he's saying. But more, I think, more to your point, they are both very introspective, and obviously coming from very different backgrounds. They saw something in each other that they connected with, and first it was music, and then. But I think there's some other personality aspect in here that, they were drawn to each other and they could relate in a way. I think George was very skeptical of the whole, pop star thing, and Eric is obviously rejecting this. The whole doesn't want to be in a band that's playing pop tunes. He wants to play blues. I think they're both sort of casting a side eye at this, going like, I'm not so sure about this. This pop star thing, even though they are pop stars and they are stuck in this very rarefied atmosphere of people who know each other in this scene.
What was I mean, I know Eric and George met at Hammersmith Odeon in '64, but there's the story of Eric describing the Beatles as well. He's called them. I can't remember exactly what he described it, but essentially he described them as wankers. And I thought if nothing illustrates how mixed up he was, that's it. Like, he seems to, on the one hand, kind of respect them, but on the other hand, doesn't get on with what they're doing, and I can't quite work it out.
Ken, I think you had a good comment about that regarding the way Eric interacted, or how he responded to Lennon and McCartney versus how he responded to George.
Wow, I'm totally blanking on it.
He was wary of Lennon, and he saw Paul as just like kind of showbiz guy. But
sure, and yeah, you're right. Thank you. That's right. That first meeting, he almost printed them. He did not like John Lennon's almost flippant attitude about things. I've done a little amateur psychological sleuthing, and I sometimes think, well, maybe it was because he too was born of a significantly dysfunctional family, although John Lennon tried to cover it up a lot and say that it was normal at various points in his life, which is completely understandable with circumstances such as those. So he almost prints John Lennon as this kind of flippant person and is wary of him. He felt like Paul came on too strong, and it was George who seemed the most real to him. And of course, they could talk about guitars in a way that felt collegial, and it was always the thing that excited George. I was telling my students last night in class, that famous moment when Brian finally wrestles a contract out of George Martin, Brian Epstein, and they send telegrams to him, right? John and Paul's are basically, when are we going to be millionaires? And George's is, we got to buy new guitars. It just goes right into practical musicianship. Let's got to grow.
Yeah. Yeah.
There seems to be so many levels that they are likely to get on, George and Eric. When you talk about, they've got guitars, I know that, they are, I think they're both spiritual in a way. And there's so many sort of tributaries to their relationship. I think it was also quite interesting the way that you guys painted the scene towards the back end of the 60s, and the pressure that Eric felt from all of that. How in 67 Sgt. Pepper's came out, and also previous to that, Eric met Jimi Hendrix, and he's clearly quite an anxious person in a way, and you can see how, and also the Music from the Big Pink, the band, came out too in 68, and you can sense this sort of mounting anxiety within him, that he's there's all this incredible groundbreaking music going on around him, and I kind of enjoyed how you guys built that up, because it sort of put it all into perspective, that that it culminated in in what was to come.
Yeah, and that carries through to end of 69, when Eric gets George on tour with Delaney and Bonnie. They were both hot on Delaney and Bonnie. They were both hot on the band. I mean, that the impact of the band at this time is massive, just in music. Like, people were responding to this in a very, very strong way. And they go on the Delaney and Bonnie tour in December 69, and again, that's another instance of them bonding, but it's also a case of them both having this experience in a group setting where they don't have to be, the star. They don't have to be right up front. They can just kind of hang back and play guitar and be with this kind of raucous group of people who are doing music that's exciting to them. And, George, they finished Abbey Road. Something is becoming a hit. It's becoming a standard practically, even already before the end of the year. And but he's happy to be out of the pressure of the Beatles, and Eric is happy to just to sort of play with this group of people that he feels like he has some sort of camaraderie with, and he likes they both like the energy of that group. So I think that's that's a critical moment for them. So many, we talk a lot about this in the book, but so many things in the following year kind of flow out of that, from the first Eric Clapton album at the beginning of the year to All Things Must Pass, to Layla, all of which share these musicians that some of those musicians were on that tour.
There's sorry, Ken, go on.
I would only add that, and this kind of root sound that the band had, now Delaney and Bonnie. I mean, what's really cool is at a certain level, Clapton and Harrison are birthing what will be the music of the 70s. Yeah. It's certainly on the rock and roll front.
Yeah, there's this sense of scope of Layla's a double album and All Things Must Pass is a triple album, and it's just sort of like this big worldview of you can do these massive, ambitious projects, and look how this can turn out.
How important was the Delaney and Bonnie tour in building confidence for both? Well, particularly Eric, but for George as well.
Well, yeah, for Eric, his first album comes out of this, and Delaney is driving a lot of that. I think we talk about this too, that he wants to keep Eric in the band as much as he can, but he's also encouraging him to do this solo album, which is really more of a Delaney album. He's driving it. It's his sound, but it does give Eric something. It gives him an experience of doing this and feeling like, okay, he can take that step. He can be the front man. He can be a solo artist. And for George, it's more, he's got a little vacation from being in the Beatles, but he's also experiencing the same kind of camaraderie that he experienced the year before in '68 when he's hanging out with Dylan and the band in Woodstock, and he's not getting that kind of experience with the Beatles. So here's a large group of people with Delaney and Bonnie, this cast of very dynamic characters, and we'll see that once we get into All Things Must Pass, is that he has the same large cast of characters, not the same people, but he has the same type of dynamic. And so, I think it was just another signpost along the way for him where he's like, yeah, this is what I want. This is, the Beatles are a closed unit. And I think he wanted something that was a little more fluid and could invite people in and, what allow for, we talk about generosity, allow for a lot more input from different people.
You mentioned the Beatles being a closed unit. One thing I found particularly interesting was that Eric was one of the only people to sort of infiltrate that closed unit in playing on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. That's pretty, it's a pretty important contribution in terms of, sort of Eric's, the way he was viewed at that time, and the way he was sort of hanging around throughout that whole sort of White Album period. He's sort of ever present in George's life. They lived near each other. They were really close friends, and then Eric played on on a Beatles track, which apart from sort of session musicians playing orchestra parts and things like that, not many people had the honor of playing on a Beatles record. Right,
like something that would stamp their personality on the record. Session musicians are playing what they're told to play, but this and Billy Preston and Nicky Hopkins on the keyboard on Revolution, they're putting a distinctive part of their personality on those records. So yeah, that is an unusual thing. Whereas, contrast with All Things Must Pass is that a lot of people are sort of putting their input into this record. George is still directing it, and he has, I think, ultimate control over these arrangements and the sound of each song, along with, you know, Phil Spector's input. But he is allowing other people to contribute, and you know, that to me, that's such a big contrast with the way the Beatles worked. It was like they were a 4-piece, 5-piece with George Martin, with, you know, rare guest appearances.
Okay, so there we have it. Part 1 of my conversation with Ken Womack and Jason Kruppa. As I always say, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I quite like geeking out in a sort of musicology way about these people. So, and it's something a little different. I know it's not strictly all studio related, but it's something a little different, and I couldn't resist getting these guys on. It was it's a fantastic book. But yeah, I recommend you go and check it out. The title of it again is All Things Must Pass Away, Harrison, Clapton and Other Assorted Love Songs. You can buy it on Amazon in the UK and in the US. I don't know if it's in bookshops here in the UK. I bought mine on Amazon. But if you're in the US, it's certainly in local bookstores, so you can go and check that out there. And I'll be back with part 2 next week. That just leaves me to say, if you would like to get in touch with me, you can do that. My website is allyouneedisdrums.com. If you'd like to buy a lovely mug to support the podcast, you can do that at the shop that's on the website. I would like to thank everybody that has bought a mug already. I really appreciate the support. Also, do go and check out Jason Kruppa's podcast, Recording the Beatles. I'm pretty sure if you listen to this podcast, you will have done already. But if you haven't, for whatever reason, go and check it out. It is a masterpiece. Thank you to Rory Hancock for uploading the podcast and sorting all the bits out for it and just generally being fantastic. Thank you to Joe Kane for the intro and outro music to this podcast, and thank you to David Henshaw for the lovely artwork he supplies. And I will see you all next week. Goodbye.